we muting, Yusuf?
We're live now, so yeah, if you want to mute.
We're live.
We're live.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this virtual meeting of the Children and Young People's Overview and Scrutiny Committee. Let's dive straight in. Apologies, Helen, if you have any.
I haven't received any.
Okay. Members' disclosures of pecuniary and non-pecuniary interest. If there are any, please unmute. No. The minutes of the previous meeting, can we just go through them quickly page by page? Rather than raising your hand, just unmute and shout. So page 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6. No? Okay. We'll take them as true and accurate. Public speakers, I don't believe we have any, Helen?
No, not today.
Okay. And then on to item 3. So can we have updates from officers first, please? And for those providing any updates, can we try and be as concise as possible, please? Brevity. I'm not sure if you want to start us off, Ian.
Just unmuting. Good morning, everybody. I'll be very brief. There's 2 significant updates at where we are at this point in time. Firstly, in relation to this summer and our socialisation offer. Today we go live. We'll make sure that you are cited on the Family Information Service bulletins that go out. It's a programme that has an entitlement expectation in terms of a passport for children and young people on the type of activities they can safely be doing this summer. Focus on socialisation, having been in lockdown ahead of the wider opening, everybody back to school in September. And that's where we come to the second update. We were very quick in getting amended guidance out last week to schools in terms of their risk assessments and action plans for September. Schools are now coming back with their updated and refreshed risk assessments and action plans for September. So they are well into planning and preparation for September and the adjustments that they'll need to make for everybody being expected to be back in schools. And then hopefully once they've made the necessary adjustments, they'll be able to have a break and refresh during this summer period. Thank you.
On mute because there's some building work going on outside the window. Thank you, Colin. Are there any more updates from officers today? I know John Coleman is on leave today. No? Okay.
Nigel has his hand up, Chair.
Aha, Nigel.
Yeah, just really briefly, Chair, if that's okay, just to say, I know if John was here, he would just want to flag to members that our referrals for children's social care are back up to normal kinds of levels. Okay. And we're just waiting to see whether this is ahead of the schools finishing at the end of this week, or if it is actually something that will carry on through the summer. But referrals last week were at the same level as, say, February, if you like, in terms of comparison. That's
okay. Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. Any questions from members to Jeff and to Colin? Pam?
Just unmute. Yes, I'd just like a few more details, if possible, about the holiday programmes for children. And also, can we have an update on how we're getting along with the school transport for September? I think it would be useful if we can get some of that information out before the schools break up, because I'm being asked lots of questions about school transport. So can we have some comments on that, please?
Okay, on school transport, we have a task and finish cell that's working on plans for September, but if I was trying to communicate them very simply, the assumption is that we'll be running normal school transport routes and services in September. The main reason behind that, because you can model a whole range of different options from massive additional transport if you could procure it, through to running minimal transport. The best modelling we can do is to assume normal levels of transport, because we do not know what parents will be doing in September. We wouldn't want any children to be left at bus stops, so we have to provide transport and monitor week after week what the level of take-up actually is before decommissioning any routes, even if the take-up is limited. Part of the work of the task and finish cell is to look at alternative ways in which children and young people could make their way to school, whether that's in terms of healthy lifestyles, cycling, walking, where that's a possibility. But there is also an expectation in that first week of the school year that the number of cars on the road will be far higher than they have been in recent months, and that is actually set out very clearly in the national guidance, that there is a view that many parents will be choosing to transport their own children to school in the first instance. In reality, we do not know the decisions that parents will make this far out from the start of the school year. So the best insurance or planning we can do is to make sure we've got at least a normal pattern of transport provision.
Can I come back on that, Chair?
Sure.
Is it possible to consult with the schools to ask the parents what they intend to do in September? I think the information that I'm getting from parents is that they want reassurance that if the children are going to use school transport, that the infection control procedures are in place on the transport, and they really don't want to leave their children at bus stops. So is there something that we can do with the schools, or ask the schools to consult with the parents to find out what they want to do?
Okay, it is the last week of the school year, so it's not a time where schools are going to be going out to do new surveys of parents, but we do meet with school leaders every week, and school leaders have been very clear that they do not know what parents' decisions are going to be in September yet, which is what we've been able to then put into the planning that our transport colleagues have been undertaking. Yes, we would like more certainty, but parents haven't made their decisions yet. On the other side, we can be very proactive in terms of the social distancing protocols that are in place and the cleaning protocols that are in place. We have shared those consistently with schools, and they are published and they are maintained in line with national guidance. Hygiene and disciplining on buses are very much part of the guidance that if you want to circulate it more widely, actually I'll make sure you've got a copy of it, because it is a worthy set of documentation and practices in its own right to build confidence around transport provision.
So the schools are writing to parents about it, are they? Have they done that? Do we know?
Writing to ask them.
Well, they're writing to let them know what's happening or what the possibilities.
Schools have been encouraged to do that. Our communication with schools is through daily bulletins and through the weekly meetings.
Okay, thanks, Ian. Thank you very much. And about the holiday programme, the programmes for children, is there more information on that?
Yes, we'll send out the Family Information Service bulletin, but in terms of the answers on that, there is some targeted work with vulnerable children and young people, targeted youth work as part of that. There is the expectation or series of opportunities that children, young people and families more widely can make the most of through Passport for the summer. And beyond that, it's been a rapid effort for those who want to put voluntary endeavour in or want to stand back up childcare services that would normally operate in the summer, given that national guidance was only issued a little matter of just over a week ago. So it's been a rapid effort for everybody who's wanted to operate safely this summer to get themselves operational so quickly. which is a long way around of saying the pattern of provision is not going to be the same as it would have been in previous years, and the quantity of provision is not going to be the same as it was in previous years. And that's where things like the Family Information Service helpline is very, very important. If somebody has a significant need in terms of childcare, and the patterns they would have relied on in the past are not good for this year.
Right, okay. Will the programmes include meals, so lunchtimes and that sort of thing?
Well, it will depend on the childcare provider and the schemes involved. But on the other side of things, there have been, even in recent days, clarifications, for example, for those who would be are entitled to free school meals, because the national scheme is operational for the 6 weeks of the summer. But in recent days, there has, amongst other things, been a clarification that, for example, Year 11s, their current schools, are responsible for securing the vouchers for their families, even if they physically have left the school. So, schools, if they haven't already, now definitely need to be applying for the vouchers for families that are entitled.
Okay, thanks very much, Ian. Thank you.
Jonathan.
Thank you, Chair. Just to follow up on the task and finish about the transport in September. I think previously you mentioned, looking at other modes, and particularly whether is there going to be a case where we need a zone around a school where parents can't drive right up to the gate to avoid that socially distanced nightmare of everyone tumbling out, and we want to actually keep the year bubbles in place. Is that still being looked at as a possibility?
Yes, there are some schools where they have requested that. Indeed, it was a case even before planning for September, when we were planning for wider opening in June. There were some schools where that was a priority for them. And working with our environment colleagues, we've been able to secure provision where they needed that. So, yes, where that question is being worked through on the risk assessment and school wants something to happen, we then have that conversation and put the plans in place.
Do you mean working with like the highways to actually put physical measures? Yeah, okay. Yeah, lovely. Thank you.
Okay, Corinne?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Ian, would it be possible to make sure that all those information about the Family Information Service and where people can find out all these, the extra stuff that's going on this summer can go out on social media quite regularly over the next couple of weeks? Because, I mean, one of my concerns is people not always finding out about it in time, and we are quite short on time now.
Indeed. And actually, Family Information Service in Warwickshire is a really strong one on social media. And if you have anybody out in your communities who are not signed up to the regular Family Information Service bulletins, encourage them to do that, because there's so much rich material in there.
Okay, thank you.
For activities for families themselves, but also how they can get support or advice if there's a shortcoming on childcare, for example.
Thanks.
Okay, any further questions from members? Okay, let's move on. So item 4, I think it's back to you then, Ian, for the Warwickshire Education Strategy Annual Review, please.
Okay. Chair, thank you. Quite a theme in this morning's papers is catch-up. There is material that was ready to go several months ago and then has been postponed as our meetings have been postponed due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And now we're playing catch up this morning. An example of that is the later paper in terms of learner outcomes and school performance. But that also does apply to the education strategy review. Our original timetable was aimed at completing the review at the end of calendar year 2019, and then it got postponed from scrutiny discussion because of the election. And then it's been postponed in subsequent meetings since. But it turned out, actually, alongside the review being due to be completed by the end of 2019, our target was to publish a refreshed education strategy at Easter 2020. Turned out to be a really good thing that we are now looking to publish the refreshed strategy in September. And that's because we have some insights and some fine tuning to our refreshed strategy coming out of the pandemic experience. So, for example, in terms of our offer for vulnerable children and young people, and what would in the past have been termed narrowing the gap, and we still hope to narrow the gap in terms of learner outcomes, there are a number of specific projects and activities, not least informed by the Education Endowment Foundation, that will fit within that. There's also a lot of learning and a lot of revolution in terms of practice, in terms of e-learning, blended learning, and distance learning. And we can put all of that learning into the refresh strategy around a key theme that head teachers have requested, and a strengthened offer and strengthened support from the local authority on curriculum development and activity. In terms of the refresh strategy, there are refreshed approaches from early years through the curriculum, a strong focus on SEND change programme, and a careful thought in terms of progression to adulthood, education, employment and training, including action to mitigate the concerns that there are post-pandemic around a tightening of provision on apprenticeships. So this morning then, for scrutiny, there is the opportunity to look at what stakeholders have asked of us in the review paper, and you can ask things of us in it ahead of the refresh strategy being adopted and published in September. So it turns out you're very, very timely in terms of your contributions this morning as we finalise what that strategy should look like from the period from September through to 2023. And at which point I will pause, so you're then able to make contributions in terms of the review paper, and then we then move forward onto the following paper, which is additional strengthening of the strategy going forwards. Thank you.
Thanks, Ian. That was a really good overview. Open the floor then to questions, but just to kick it off, are we confident that September is a deadline that we'll reach and won't be put back at all due to further implications of the pandemic?
I think we've got all of the thinking in terms of review work and project development work in place to be able to go to Cabinet in September and roll out. And there's always good psychology in the education sector when you're able to launch a fresh energy and a fresh set of approaches in September. Better than July, let's put it that way.
Okay. Questions then, members? Colin, do you want to come in first?
Yes, just to say that I think this is a really important paper for us to go through in some detail, because the strategy was always ever going to be only as good as its implementation. And there were some big tasks here, and although the strategy in itself was quite a simple and concise document, there's a lot that lies underneath it. And it's just making sure that there is actual progress in some of these areas, that we're actually making a difference by this strategy. It's easy to populate things with all sorts of boards and working groups and other bits and pieces. But at the end of the day, it's the outcome for children that is going to be important. And that, from my mind at least, will be the judgment on whether this strategy is being successful or not.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Margaret, do you want to come in?
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, sure. On the page on learners currently missing education, page 19, I think it is, we're looking for a sponsor for a new alternative provision school, which is great. That's something we should support. I'm a little bit confused because we went for a visit to the Kersley Centre, which I believe provides alternative provision. I don't know whether we're building on that or whether we are doing something completely separate, or where the Kersley Centre fits in our plans for children who need alternative provision. So that's one of my queries. Chairman, I've got quite a lot of questions. Do you want me to just do one and pause and then I'll come back later?
If you want to have five or 6 minutes to ask questions, do so.
All right. Okay. Thank you. The other one about looked after children. This is a little bit specific, actually, but as many of you will know, that there was a specific problem in my area. I know we give priority to children who are looked after when it comes to school placements, and that's absolutely what we should do. Without going into great detail, there was an incident in my area where, because of the placement of a sibling of a foster child, actually a natural child of the parents who were fostering a child, this looked after child was put at risk. And I have asked if the policy can be reviewed so that not only do we give looked after children priority, but if the placement of another child in the family puts that foster placement at risk, then that should be taken into consideration. We were at a point where we may have had to have a child lose a foster placement because of where the natural child of the family was being placed, and therefore I think this won't happen very often, but when it does, it's caused great distress. It has now been resolved, thanks to everybody who did that, but I just think we ought to just look at the policy on that so we can anticipate this in case it happens again. What else had I got? Yeah, and on the one with SEND, on the page for SEND, which is can't find the page number, it's a little bit further on. 93% of children with EHC plans in good and outstanding schools. Does that imply that when placing children with an EHC, or if a child has an EHC, they get priority for schools that are judged good or outstanding? So I'm not quite sure which way around this happens. Are we looking for children who are in schools and we're trying to get all schools up to good, but do these children get priority? Because that's what it seems to say in our strategy. Where else did I find something? Oh yes, a bit further on the on the early years, I was really pleased to see that early years was such a priority. I don't understand why we don't have a school readiness target for all the children in nursery placements, so that we know they've got to a certain standard. And I'm not necessarily talking about educational standard, although some of that will be important. I'm talking about things like being able to put your own shoes and your own coat on and be able to cope with going to the toilet, etc. Because then they're off to a flying start in reception and not having to start with all these basic needs there. And as most of the nurseries are receiving money for free places, I don't see why they can't be attached to this government funding a target for these places to get the children specifically ready to school. So we ought to, as a county, have an expectation of this is where we expect our children to be when they go to reception. I'll pause there, but Chairman, I won't promise not to come back in. Thank you.
Ian or Colin, do you want to come in?
Okay. Thank you, Chair. In terms of the performance indicator on school readiness in terms of early years, actually, Councillor Margaret, it's actually really timely to be talking about that because alongside the education strategy, we're shortly due to be bringing forward an integrated early years strategy looking at the pattern of entitlement and experiences that the universal population of children should have and their families, but also the targeted work around early identification and support for SEND. That paper will be coming through shortly, and certainly the school readiness indicator would be a healthy one within the integrated early years strategy measures of success. Okay. We talked before around admissions policy, and admissions policy itself can be subject to cyclical review. Like you, I was very pleased that the procedures in law around admissions actually worked out for the family in this instance. I know there was concern and anxiety along the way, but it did prove to be a situation where the individual circumstances outweighed the impact on the wider school population in the correct appeals process. We can look at fine-tuning wording within the admissions policy, but we would have to stay within the national framework and legal framework on admissions in any changes that we make. But we can definitely commit to working that one through on a cyclical review. And then in terms of alternative provision, the AP Free School is in development at the moment, but it is not the only provision. The last thing we would want is a situation where more children and young people are out of their local school. So part of the pattern of provision has to be around the culture and support for mainstream schools in meeting the needs of their local population as far as they possibly can. But then we also need a continuum of provision for those who are excluded and are unable to make access of their local school. So that can include bespoke individual programs, but it can, with evidence, include the alternative provision free school model as well. And in terms of SEND, it's not that placements are restricted, because the point with SEND placements is that it's the appropriate placement for the child and young people at their level of need. Again, we wouldn't want them sucked up the continuum to more complex placements. We would want them to thrive wherever they can as part of their home and local community. Now, there are dangers. The SEND Change Programme is a massive change programme for the council, because we have got to modernise and update and make more child and young person and family centric our activities and our programmes. We need to do that without creating a reliance on support services, because in the long term that doesn't help on a young person's resilience and skills for the future. But we do need to get the pattern of provision in terms of mainstream schools, mainstream school resource bases, special schools, and indeed independent school placement usage right. If you look at the pattern of placements over the years, you wouldn't want to destabilise current placements which children and young people are using, but the pattern in Warwickshire is for more people to be drawn up the continuum to complex placements than the population in similar profile authorities. So how do we get out of that? It is about investing in the skills in mainstream schools and mainstream bases, ultimately changing the population in our special schools, so not a threat to continuation of our special schools, but having them meeting more complex needs than they are at the moment, and thereby reducing the number of independent special school placements. And then when it comes to the performance indicator, we would want those children and young people to be having a good education experience. And that's where it comes back to this proxy indicator, which is around good schools.
Thank you. Thanks very much for that, Ian. That was really helpful. Can I just go back though to this alternative provision? I am genuinely confused about places like the Kersley Centre. I'm only mentioning that because we went to a visit there. There'll be other places as well. So what I think we seem to be saying is that there will be a free school, which is an alternative provision, but there are places like the Kersley Centre which might also be used for children if they cannot stay in our schools. I'm just not sure where everything fits into the pattern of what's available for children.
Yeah, I think it'd be really helpful if we do a briefing note for you in terms of what the pattern of provision looks like moving up the continuum. Because of course we do have a framework of alternative education providers,
right?
Which is where we do the bespoke packages for children and young people with accreditation in terms of the more practical training that
Right.
most of those providers offer, whereas the AP Free School is much more of a traditional core curriculum school environment.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Okay, Howard. Howard, you may be on mute.
Okay, my question is, I come from a place called Rugby, and we have quite a lot of people who are travellers who have children. What is the, how do we deal with students that are very mobile?
Okay, actually, in terms of traveller education, a long tradition of trying to encourage stability in school placements and accessing of school placements, and that requires to make stable school placements a really positive relationship with the families and developing that over time.
So do they affect our figures? Because we've seen Rugby sort of go down in the sort of achievement figures.
No, and that wouldn't be a significant effect on the overall population data. Much more that's around making sure that every school is good in terms of its teaching, learning, and learner outcomes and assessments. But when we get to that paper a little bit later on, though, there's going to be a real pause before we get any fresh, meaningful data from the school system on learner outcomes and relative performance between schools. The data that we have is frozen at 2019 for the foreseeable future.
Okay. And my final part to this question is, does Warwickshire talk to other Shire counties when travellers move across borders?
Yeah, and traveller education support and services do link with each other, and schools link with each other. Now, if there's a situation with a particular family or a hotspot school where you would like us to look into whether it's working well in practice, we are always open to do that.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Corinne.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I just got a couple of questions, Ian. The scheme to put dedicated nurses in all schools to support those with emotional, mental health and wellbeing issues, is that all sort of up and running in most schools now, or is that still in the early stages? And then when young people return in school in September, is that going to be still a mix of different types of learning? Is it still going to include some home learning and blended learning, or is it just, you know, purely back in school? And then my final one, I'm really glad to see the focus on early years, and particularly about encouraging families to support young people with home learning. But it says that the gap in good level of development at age 5 for disadvantaged children compared to non-disadvantaged has increased not only in Warwickshire but nationally, and I wondered if you knew why that was. And I think that possibly throws even extra support behind the whole. I know we've already had a bit of a conversation about the funding for maintained nurseries, and I think that's an issue with all of those maintained nurseries in Warwickshire that are obviously in deprived areas already for the most disadvantaged children. And I think it really sort of puts even more weight behind the fact that they do need to be properly funded and know where they are in the future. But I did wonder if you knew the reasons why those gaps are getting bigger.
Yeah. And actually, for anybody who's got a little bit of time, it is worth looking at the Education Endowment Foundation research in this area. I think in my introductory comments, I was very laboured over the concept of narrowing the gap, because for many of us, for many, many years, the concept of narrowing the gap was a goal that we wanted to make significant progress on. And yet we are in this phase where the gap is widening. And what are the insights into why it is widening? Well, what it shows you is how important engaging with good quality early years provision and engaging with school is for children from low income backgrounds and for those with vulnerabilities. So when we talk around our offer for vulnerable children and young people, the socialisation offer, the family support offer, in some instances the SMEH offer, and if they are supported and are in a position where they're able to benefit from being back in the school environment, then the tutoring offer and recovering the lost ground on the curriculum that there has been over the last 4 months. That's where that challenge is. And yes, in normal times I would have said narrowing the gap, but first off we've got to stop the gap getting wider and then narrow the gap for each of those as individuals with a tailored, personalised programme, and then collectively, if it is right for them and it has the impact that the Education Endowment Foundation research would indicate, then we will be back on narrowing the gap. There's a big link though there to the point on blended learning, because the aim is for every child and young person to be back in the school environment in September. We have the systems in place where there is an incident or there is an outbreak or likely outbreak in a school to be able to follow that up very quickly in the last few weeks, almost within the hour, to get testing and support and advice and to check that isolation is happening for the bubbles and staff where appropriate. For the new school year, schools will be issued with a number of tests, so we're not even then dependent on couriering tests to the school. And why do I mention all of that? Every school is expected to have a contingency plan to be able to move straight from everybody being in school, being educated in the classroom, back to distance learning, e-learning, blended learning, as instances of that. So if a group has to self-isolate or a school has to close down for a period because of a local spike or outbreak of coronavirus, it won't have the disruption to children's education that it had in past months. So that every school has to have a plan to be able to switch over should an outbreak occur. And then the third point there was around SMEH, social mental health needs. They've been definitely to the fore in our understanding over the last few months of coronavirus response and the support that's in place for children and young people that have been struggling in this period. And it was identified in the Empower review as well that there was a deficit in terms of the pattern of provision on SMEH in Warwickshire, which we needed to address and strengthen, whether it was through the RISE service, the health service focused in this area, or through the joined up and linked up approach in education for those with high levels of SMEH. It'd be wrong for me to say anything other than that is still work in progress. There is more impact and more work that needs to be done around the design and follow through on SMEH support, which is a linkage to the Send Change programme itself. And Dwayne's with us for that item, an update later in the morning.
Thank you. And I thought Margaret's idea about getting the briefing note regarding the different tiers of schools was really useful. I'd appreciate that as well. Thank you.
Okay. Jonathan.
Thank you. Yes, I've got another question on the alternative provision settings and learners missing education. One of the aims, it says in the refresh, is about that reintegration once children have been into an alternative provision setting. And certainly my experience is that's one of the weaknesses of the system, that a child gets sent by school, they get put into alternative provision, and then there's very little contact between the school and the alternate provision setting. So I just wondered, one of the things we're looking at, the possibility of even those alternate provision delivering some education in schools and sort of building that bridge between the school and the alternative provision setting. And so it's like a much more dynamic feel, but the people that the children trust are kind of maybe coming back with them into school.
Actually, so right. What you would prefer, every package has to be bespoke and appropriate to the child or young person. But for the majority, the vast majority, if we could be in a position where they do not lose their link with their parent school, their local school, and that the intervention could be more short-term therapeutic intervention, flexible timetabling before a successful reintegration back full-time in that school, that's a good scenario for me. Then there are alternative scenarios that are known to be successful, including, of course, managed moves, where the relationship is irrevocably broken down, but with appropriate transitional support to make the prospect of a managed move successful. And yes, there will also be some youngsters, hopefully an ever smaller number of youngsters, where the provision is outside of that local system. But what we have to guard against by making sure that our support services are well designed and doing well in practice is this tendency for too many youngsters to be drawn up to complex placements and patterns of provision and becoming dependent on those alternative education providers. I don't know, Dwayne might want to come in on this one as well.
Hi. Yeah, hi everybody. In terms of alternative provision, that's part of the Send Change programme as well. We are going to be looking at it, as you rightly said. I mean, when we look at how we use our AP providers in Warwickshire, it varies. So we use it through the exclusion route. So and therefore the fair access protocol, which is being worked on and being delivered and refreshed, needs to be applied. We also use AP at post 16 for some of our learners. In particular, I would say those with education, health and care plan. But we also use AP under the medical needs policy. So I think, since I've started here, what I'm doing is actually pulling all that together to look at the picture. Now, in some of the guidance, it is quite explicit in terms of the responsibility. So if we look at placing AP via the medical needs policy, then we would be looking at ownership remaining with the schools. Yeah. And therefore the reviewing of children's provision, whilst under that framework and under that provision should always be undertaken as a multidisciplinary team. I have found areas in there that need to be improved on, and I think the referral rate into that type of provision and that service to be, how can I explain, to be quite low in terms of they being referred in with GPs, and actually at the end of it then there's no accountability, so health are not remaining involved. And for me, I think there's a moral dilemma there in terms of if you're saying a young person is too sick to go to school for their health, then there must be health oversight, and the guidance document does relate to that. So I'm obviously looking at that. In terms of the FAP, what we're looking at is a revolving door provision. So if a young person gets excluded, how quickly can we get that young person back into school? The local authority have a statutory 6-day period in terms of we must put in place education on the 6th day of an exclusion. So at the moment is how we use the APs to do that and what is their involvement with schools. And I know Marie Rooney's working on that. The other one is when we're placing our young people in AP, perhaps at post-16 or partway through the school. And what we're looking is at the commissioning framework. So actually we get the alternative providers all across Warwickshire on a framework. So we actually start setting the standard of what we expect. And what we commission. What's really difficult at the moment, and again is going to be working with our leaders and our school leaders, is schools sometimes commission that off their own backs as well. So for me is how do we align with our school leadership to make sure that our offer, especially around the AP world, is as robust as it can be and is producing good or better outcomes and is progressive. What we don't want to do, for example, I got one learner this year, a request has come in for AP, but actually what they're offering would be regression, yeah, because they're doing lower than a GCSE, and this individual has done their GCSE. So we must make sure that if they're offering an educational basis, what does that look like? Is it progressive? Is it producing good or better outcomes? So you can't take AP in isolation. We do use it a lot, but what we need to make sure that when we are using it, it meets Warwickshire County Council standards. We've got a good quality assurance, robust framework in which we're operating off, that the courses they're offering are progressive, and that we're always keeping that link with schools, and actually the threshold that we're accessing that is robust and clear also, and that there is a multidisciplinary team involvement with that child and young person. I think in my perspective, it's always about keeping that young person as much as we can in the school setting, because what evidence does suggest when we remove them from school, the return to school at the moment is not positive. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's certainly in the Send Change programme as well.
Lovely. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you both. Margaret, do you want to come back in?
Yes, please, Chairman, if you don't mind. So I'm now looking at the I say it's page 35 or 7 of 9. I'm not quite sure which way to go. And it's where we look at the individual objectives and see how successful we're being, etc. So the one on sufficient school places to meet the demands of in Warwickshire. So I think the aim is secure and make available sufficient school places in all areas of the county. Now, I know that we do strive to do this, but judging by the number of complaints I've had this year, it's not been wildly successful this year in North Warwickshire. And in fact, North Warwickshire as a borough are now very concerned about the number of school places available for our children. We've got children now who are being sent out of county for school because we haven't got enough places. We've also got children who are being sent in quite unexpected places to go to school, which is costing us money because, of course, we're sending them so far away that we have to provide transport. Now, I know this is challenging, but to me, there are two things. One is the children we already have in our school system and making sure that where we've got bulges coming in, or where we've expanded schools lower down the age range, that we are anticipating that bulge, moving up through the school and making sure the provision is there in good time for those children to come up. That's I suppose the relatively easy bit. Then we've got the other bit where all over the county, and certainly in North Warwickshire, we've got large developments taking place, and we need to anticipate the demand for school there. And it's a great aim, but I am afraid, and you may be able to reassure me, that we seem to be going backwards slightly on this, that the school places that are available is actually getting worse and not better. So I would like a comment on that, please. And then as I'm speaking, I'll just go on to where the bit on page 61 where it's "you said we did," which was fantastic. It's really good that we've got that we've asked people how do we need to change our strategy, and we've responded. That's really very good. Thank you. There's a couple of points on points 4 and 5 where the schools are saying they're expecting to provide counselling and therapy for children, which they probably are, and that because the safeguarding thresholds are so high, there's a lot of pressure put on schools. And I just want to ask what we're putting in place to support schools to take on these very important roles of early intervention where there are issues with children. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. In terms of the last point in question, I think one of the things that would be really helpful to send around to scrutiny panel members, and we can also commission a later report in terms of its impact as well, is the safeguarding offer for 2021. We've done a lot of work in terms of recommissioning our safeguarding offer and making sure that it is coherent between ourselves and children's social care, and that within that there are some really key building blocks, including a whole range of training and development opportunities for the school workforce to make the most of in terms of their capacity building, but also making sure that there are the close links between school leaders and DSLs in schools and the local children's social care team managers, regular liaison meetings, but also the kind of relationship where the DSL or the school leader would be able to have a conversation around children and families that they have a concern about as background to de-escalation or escalation in terms of support for the relevant families. But we'll send round a copy of the safeguarding offer and the training offer, so you're cited on it, but then quite happily bring a report later in the year as to the level of satisfaction with it and the impact that it's having.
Thank you.
Okay. So that's that side of things. In relation to admissions, there is a draft, if it hasn't gone around already, in terms of the admissions and appeals position this year. Councillor Bell, I'm really respectful of your local experience on this one. It's not mirrored across the county, which is a long way around of saying there are localised issues in terms of the supply of school places. You'll also, as scrutiny on the forward work programme, you do have the sufficiency annual review. We do check the position on sufficiency each year, and what that then leads into is part of the capital programme locally in terms of expansion of school places, alongside, of course, the national mechanisms for commissioning new school places. And that's where we come to the issue around new housing developments, large-scale housing developments, because in those instances, it isn't the adding of additional classrooms to currently established schools. We have to go through that lengthy commissioning process, the free school commissioning process nationally. to put in whole new schools, which is one of the drivers pragmatically for us expanding schools where we can, rather than establishing new schools. So there is the summary note on its way round in terms of this year's admissions pattern. We have had less complaints this year on admissions. We've been able to satisfy many parental preferences, but you are right, there are hotspots though as well, which we have to make very careful attention to in terms of the annual sufficiency statement and follow through in terms of projects.
Thank you. Chairman, may I suggest that for another meeting we get a report on availability of school places across the county, so we can identify where these hotspots are and then understand what actions being taken to ensure that that there's better provision in the future. Thank you.
Yeah, that one is scheduled at the moment for September's scrutiny.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Colin.
I just wanted to pick up on some of Margaret's points from a slightly different perspective. And my answer is going to be more general than Ian's, obviously. I think because a number of schools are struggling within their budgets. My fear is that it will be leading some of them to be less inclusive, or feel that they can be less inclusive than perhaps they might want to. So they're suggesting that children might belong more in specialist schools, and they're struggling to cope in mainstream schools. And in turn, that is getting parents now to be saying, I think I want my child in a specialist school. Whereas a few years ago, it was quite the opposite. A few years ago, parents were demanding that their children be dealt with in mainstream schools. So there is an issue, I think, in how we can support schools, particularly the primaries and our maintained primaries, how we can support them in supporting children with needs that might otherwise get pushed into high-cost specialist places. So that's a very general observation, but that's just something that's bothering me as I'm seeing some of this develop.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Colin. Right, if there are no more questions, the recommendation on the paper is in front of you. If everyone's happy with it, agree to it. Any objectors, do please say. No? Okay. Right, thank you, Ian. Thank you, Colin. We'll move on to item 5, but apologies to members of the committee and officers. I need to make an urgent phone call. So, Pam, may I ask you to take the chair for this item, please?
Yes, that's fine. Okay. Okay, where are we? Right, so who's taking the lead with this one then?
Okay. It's not entirely separate to item 4, in that it's the logical next step that we would be doing at this time of year, which is having reflected on the impact of the strategy over its life so far. What are the things that we want to see in the strategy and in our delivery plans for September 2020 through to 2023. So part of it, what we discussed now, are things that you would have naturally come up with through your review of the situation on education in Warwickshire. Some of it might be really up to date from the experience, the things that you've listened to and have seen during this COVID recovery period as well. And then particular examples on that one would be around our offer for vulnerable children and young people in this time ahead, that focus on how we do narrow the gap. We touched on many themes that could be in this next few minutes. We touched on the SEND change programme, which will be much more prominent and much more active than in the education strategy so far. We've touched on early years and the importance of narrowing the gap early. That's a good start to education experience for children and young people. So there's so many areas we could go into, but your feedback though at this point is really timely, because we can make sure that we incorporate that into the report in the format, the strategy that goes to Cabinet and is at the heart of our work from September.
Okay, thank you. So any questions from anybody? Any comments? Okay, I think we've covered quite a lot in with Margaret in the previous conversation. So shall we move on now to the next item?
Okay, and yes, faithfully, we will follow up on all of the suggestions from scrutiny, mostly on that review item, but in the draft that goes forward for publication in September.
Okay, so the next, so we've looked at, so I think Helen's just bringing up the next item. Have we got it, Helen? So this is
It should be shown on your screens now. Can you all see that?
Yes, I can see it now. Agenda item 6. Okay. This is the achievement of Warwickshire children and young people in the statutory national tests. Is this you again, Ian?
Yes. Again, this was one that originally was due to be considered by scrutiny at the back end of last year and was postponed when we had the elections, and then has subsequently been postponed through the COVID period as well. And then over the last couple of weeks, we have confirmation of what's going to be challenging over the time ahead in relation to our understanding of learner outcomes and our understanding of school performance. So you have here a full data report, data set in terms of 2019 learner outcomes, assessments and examination outcomes. This summer, as you know, the examination outcomes are going to be on a different basis to traditional examinations. But we will have the published outcomes. Learners will be getting their outcomes for GCSEs and A-levels on the normal published dates. And we are making sure that they have got access to emotional support and practical advice and support. We're making sure that school leaders have got all the relevant emails and phone numbers to follow up support for individual young people in these unusual times. So yes, back end of 2020, we'll be able to share those examination outcomes, but what we won't have are learner assessments, traditional key stage assessments, because all of those have been set aside. What does that then also mean to us? Well, we are still holding the statutory responsibility to promote and secure school improvement. We still have the mechanism in place to broker and support individual schools going through difficult times. But what would you usually use as the tools to indicate which schools need careful thought, attention, nurture, intervention? Well, you would usually look at things like the health and well-being of governance and school leadership. Are there indicators in terms of absence of school leaders that there's an issue in an individual school? Similarly, we have the data around financial performance, and we can use that information to assess if a school is going through a difficult time in terms of its governance and leadership when it's heading towards a significant deficit position, that it hasn't got the plan and the structure to follow through. But we would always be looking at learner assessments as well, and we do not have that, and we will not have that in the time ahead until that information is once again systemically being collected and used at the moment, to try and substitute a local arrangement for the national arrangements on that would be very contrary to the national guidance on COVID-19. So we are in discussions with school leaders at the moment around how do we collectively identify those schools in need of support and intervention in the year ahead. Okay, so that's where we are on the system side, but you do have that full set of indicators there as well from the 2019 harvest, which itself has been part of what has fed into the strategy review and refresh.
Yeah, okay. Okay, thanks, Ian. Any questions? Margaret? Margaret?
Thank you very much, Pam. Yeah. Yes, I was looking at the 2019 results because, as Ian says, it's going to be a bit tricky this year. But looking at those, it was really heartening to see that the Key Stage 1 results had shown general improvement across the board, which is really very encouraging. However, Key Stage 2 are very disappointing, and I just wondered why. It seems to be pretty poor across the board there, and perhaps Ian could give us a bit of an explanation. And then, of course, we go on to things that we seem to talk about this every time we meet. If we look at the Key Stage 4 results, we've got, never mind closing the gap within schools between disadvantaged and the others, we've got a huge gap in Warwickshire between North Warwickshire and Nuneaton and Bedworth, and then the rest of the county. And we don't seem to be doing very much to close that gap at all. There are some very small improvements in some areas, which of course are encouraging, but there is still this enormous gap, and I just don't see why it should be there. Because at Key Stage 1, it's not visible, and so why is it that as the children get older, the gaps get wider? And Ian's talking about identifying and supporting schools that need support. Of course, we need to do that, but we just do seem to talk about this all the time and get very, very little progress made. So a bit more comment on that would be helpful. Thank you.
Ian, would you like to respond, please?
Okay, and actually the response on this one could get a little bit circular. Because I try and look at things systemically, almost from an individual child or young person perspective, a school perspective, a local system perspective, as well as a local authority perspective. Firstly, an obvious thing in terms of data, children aren't in all of the key stage cohorts at the same time. So there can be variation between one year and the next year. As each cohort is different to the previous year's cohort. So for some of this, you need to look at, as Councillor Bell was indicating, the trends over a longer period. And if you look at the trends on the Warwickshire data over a period, you would always come back to the conclusion that outcomes in the Nuneaton area lag even the outcomes in the Bedworth area and consequently also other districts within the county. Hence, that's a pressing data driver, performance driver for the Nuneaton education strategy. And if we get the impacts that we want from the Nuneaton education strategy, we can look at the targeted work within that area. In some instances, practice that could be applied across the whole county, or as an approach that we move into other areas, including, for example, some of the areas of Rugby, for example, if we wanted to move beyond that focus of the limited resources we have and targeted work in Nuneaton. Why is targeted work important? Well, targeted work is very important at a number of levels. At the Nuneaton education strategy level, there is a reasonable group of school leaders there who can challenge each other if they've got the culture right, and share and encourage each other in dealing with some of the themes that are prevalent on that patch that get in the way of children being able to make the most of their education offer. There is also the scale there to be able to do targeted professional development for the workforce, whether teachers or a range of support staff positions and multi-agency development as well. There's a scale there that means they can align training days and training programs within the group. Where do I go from there? Well, I'm starting to get down to a much more localized thinking entirely, which is if the governance and the leadership team have got the skills, disciplines and drills that you would want to have in any individual school, they would be drilling back down through the data to look at different themes that there are within the school. And when you do that in almost any secondary school in the country, applies to some extent in primary as well, you will find strengths in different curriculum areas, different classes, different individual children and young people and teachers. That gives you an opportunity to look at the skills and strengths that you have within the school and to spread it more widely within that school community, or in the case of something like that, Nuneaton Education Strategy community, more widely across schools within the patch. You can build on the strengths, plus also you can broker in training development and practice models that will address the deficits that you have in the individual schools. I talk about drills and disciplines. Of course, there will be some schools where those practices have dissipated, the energy is gone, the rigour is gone, either because of issues in governance or tiredness in leadership. Those are the kind of situations which we would be using this data report, or the data that underpins this report, to have those questions with the chair of governors and the head teacher, with an aim to either supportively getting the energy and the discipline back and the rigour back, or brokering another approach, or even brokering some changes in leadership where, with regret, that's what's necessary to get momentum going.
Thank you, Chairman. Can I just come back in there and say, you know, we welcomed and have great hopes for the Nuneaton Education Strategy, and it will look forward to getting an update on the impact of that. But going down to an even more micro level, and we mention this every time, we have to mention the Midlands Academy Trust, because they are a great impact on the Key Stage 4 results that we get in our area, both in North Warwickshire, because our children go to some of those schools, and in Nuneaton. And my question really is, what's happening there? Have there been progress? Are they engaging in the Nuneaton strategy? And what impact has that Nuneaton strategy had on that trust to date?
Okay, thanks, Mark. Yeah, just to let you know, we've got one more question. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Actually, one of the things we could helpfully do on that one is circulate an update briefing in terms of where the Midland Academies Trust is in terms of performance of its schools. Of course, it will then be superseded again with the exam outcomes later this summer, which then gets to the core of my answer on this one. Yes, they have been very cooperative over the last months with their colleagues across Nuneaton. And in terms of working with us as an authority, there are some green shoots in their data and indeed their in-house assessments prior to the COVID-19 disruption to the system. There were green shoots. There's a long way to go to then have a proper pattern of provision that secures the outcomes consistently year after year. So it would have been, well, we will look with real interest at what the outcomes are this summer to see if the predictions and the tracking that we're encouraging for the schools within the trust do deliver a reality in terms of the exam outcomes this summer, and then move on to next year as well. But yes, they are engaging with their colleagues.
Okay, thanks, Ian. We have 4 more questions. Okay, so first of all, we have Colin. Colin, can I ask you to come in?
Thank you. Just almost to reinforce what Margaret was saying, and I'm looking specifically on page 76 at table 4 on the key stage 4 results. And you can see there that North Warwickshire, unfortunately, is running non-eaten bread with a very close second or on outcomes. I mean, this is what happens with kids at the end of almost at the end of their school progression. This is what they're going out into the world with, these sort of results that are shown here. Strong passes in English and maths and things. Stratford's almost twice as good in that respect as are both non-eaten and Warwickshire, non-eaten bread with and North Warwickshire. This really is key stuff. And it isn't as if educational outcomes are consistent across North Warwickshire and Nuneaton and Bedworth. Both areas contain outstanding schools. So it can be done in those areas. There are parts of Nuneaton and Bedworth that can produce really outstanding schools and outstanding results. And in North Warwickshire, Polesworth School, for example. But yet here we are with a series of results that just shows that it just shows where disadvantage works its way from schooling into social systems and everything else, because these are the outcomes that young people are finishing with. And it's good that we're looking at Nuneaton and Bedworth, but I also say we ought to be looking at North Warwickshire as well, because yes, there are some schools that are on the borders in Margaret's area that are attending Nuneaton schools, but generally speaking, both areas are poor compared with the rest of the county, and frighteningly poor compared with the outcomes with, say, Stratford.
Okay, thanks, Colin. So can I ask Corinne to come in now, please? Corinne, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, sure. Just an observation, really. I know when we went to the Multi Academy Trust for the day that time, they were talking about their destinations for their young people, and the fact that a lot of their young people went on to do more vocational courses. Now, I mean, I'm not necessarily convinced that that's always the sort of best route, but I think it is a route, and I think it would be interesting to know. I know we sort of touch on the A-level results on here as well, but it would be interesting to know what sort of destinations they do go on to, and what they achieve then, because sometimes people or young people can be in a school and not necessarily motivated by that, but once they get to do whatever it is, catering, mechanics, hairdressing or whatever, can start to fly. And it would be interesting to know at least their destinations and what those young people from those schools are doing and where they go with it. So as I say, just an observation rather than anything else, but I think it would be, and on top of that, just another point, that young people that were doing vocational qualifications have certainly been kind of largely kind of left out during this whole COVID thing, because a lot of them were not knowing what was going to happen with whether they were getting predicted grades. My own daughter was doing a BTEC in graphic design, and it was left right till the end to tell them. And for her, I mean, I pay a monthly amount for her to get something called Creative Cloud. That's not cheap, and she does have that on a reasonable laptop. But I would imagine if young people were at home and didn't have access to that Creative Cloud, they would have been very disadvantaged in trying to do that final piece of work. In the end, they did eventually come and tell them that they were going to get their predicted grades, but it was only very recently. So a lot of young people on vocational courses were really struggling to try to keep up with their work at a distance. So, whether that impacts on results, I don't know.
Okay, thanks, Corinne. Ian, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah. Just at the end there, we were saying a little bit earlier, we've made sure that schools have got the contacts to be able to follow through. Should young people need advice on what their next steps might be after GCSE or A-level results aren't what they would expect them to be. It was a short-term set of decisions to try and support this year's Year 11 and Year 13. I think there was serious intent in terms of national statements around wanting to make sure that none of the current Year 11 and Year 13 were disadvantaged by the emergency. But the devil will be in the detail on that one. We'll have to work through, make sure that they are supported, and where appropriately they get reassessments during the autumn. At the moment, of course, there is a very live consultation underway on adjustments on the syllabus and assessment techniques, both for vocational and academic routes for affecting the Year 10 and Year 12 as they go through for their significant assessments next year. And I really would encourage anybody to look at the current consultation there and respond to the Ofqual survey and assessment, which goes through things area by area, both vocational and academic, in some detail.
Okay, thanks, Ian. I have one more question, Ian, and that's Pete Gilbert. Pete, can I ask you to come in, please?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, just to comment on a couple of things. Colin is right when it comes to the north of the county and the Nuneaton and Bedworth. There are schools that achieve the level of education that we want, and these schools cover similar areas of deprivation as well and still achieve some of the educational goals that we want. And it strikes me that 3 years in, that I am, and nearly done and up for election again, that it's Groundhog Day. We say the same things. Now, I've been to the Midlands Academy Trust a few times. We've had them to the building a few times. And I've mentioned this before, that's how much it is Groundhog Day, that when we get them in the room and officers in the room, I sometimes get confused who the politicians are, because it's the same rehashed formula of words, of positive sound bites. The only thing that alters is the kids whose education has been at a low standards move on from out of school, and then they move on to another set of kids. And the management, the infrastructure, the gaffers don't change. You know, I don't blame the teachers, but surely if your team's not performing time after time after time, you don't keep the same captain and coach. And I believe there needs to be a huge shift in management and how that place is structured, because it's just letting down people constantly. These kids are leaving those schools with not the set of skills they require. Now we've got COVID in the mix. They weren't in a strong place anyway. So you can't deal with those situations when you're off a weak footing from the start. So I don't want to switch off from the argument about the Academy Trust, because it's so repetitive and it's always the same. But we need something to happen. Something's got to change. It's becoming a joke now. We should not be getting green shoots 3 years in. Those kids have moved on. Their educational clock has ticked by, and something needs to give. It really does.
Okay, thank you, Pete. Ian, would you like to comment, please?
Yeah, and from my perspective, there's a lot that has merit in what was just said there, but actually, if you look at academies over recent years, you'll see there's an increasing frequency to which they change over head teachers. And I think there's a potential drawback with that. With every new leader comes a change in perspective, which might bring dividends in terms of both the practice and outcomes over time. But there's a risk to be managed in that as well, around people not being sure around practice and expectations within the academy. So for me, it's balancing, making sure you've got the right skills in the leadership, and the leadership of those schools, those academies in that trust has changed over consistently over recent years, quite regularly. but balancing, making sure you've got the right skills and experience in the leadership with a systemic and rigorous approach to the changes that you need to have in place, whether that's in terms of the assessment and tracking of individual children and young people, or around a framework around them that means that they are aspirational with clear goals, know which milestones they've got to hit if they're going to make the future for themselves that they aspire to.
Okay, thanks, Ian. Pete, do you want to come back?
Briefly point out, yes, thank you. It was not the head teachers that are my concern. I just want good head teachers to go to a school and stay there. I was thinking a little higher up than head teachers. Yeah. That's my concern. You know, good head teachers in good schools are worth their weight in gold. And I want head teachers. They used to stay at schools for a long time, and I wish people still did that. But it's a little higher up we have the problems. There, I had somebody speak to me very positively about what they were going to do there. They didn't achieve it, and they've moved on to their holiday homes, to their index-linked pensions, to no mortgages, to their life. Our kids aren't in that position and never will be if their hands are shackled with a poor education when they leave school. It's a two-way street. I know the kids have got to turn up. I know the parents have got to be involved. I know the teachers have got to be on their ball, and the head teachers have got to be prepared as well. But the higher management structures, you can't keep sticking with it when you've got the same results. Someone's got to take responsibility. The buck has to stop somewhere.
Okay, thanks, Pete. That's any more questions? I haven't got any more hands up on this item. Okay, thanks, Ian. I think we're moving now on to agenda item 7, and I think Youssef is going to take over. Are you there, Youssef?
I am. Thanks, Pam.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so this is the dedicated school grant recovery plan, which is a follow-up from the paper we had at the last OSC and the paper that went to Cabinet last week. So I think Dwayne is going to introduce for us.
Yes, hi everybody. So we've taken the plan to Cabinet and Corporate Board, and basically what we're asking now is for scrutiny to look over the Send and Inclusion programme. The appendices are attached to the document. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have on there. I don't know if you've got all appendices with you at the moment. Yeah, can we pull some up? So what we've got is the DSG sustainability and the recovery plan. We've also got what is the Empower report, which we've pulled in, and also the SEND strategy. So what we are doing is pulling all the areas into one plan. And what we're going to do, here they are. Can you stop on that one, please? So we've identified in the sort of plan, we've identified 31 projects in terms of we need to look at and to change. Each project we're working on at the moment with our project team, where we're going to be costing the projects. And happy to have any discussions really around any of the projects or any concerns anybody may have with the change programme.
Okay, thank you, Dwayne. Who would like to come in? Margaret.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Chairman. First of all, I'd like to say on page 89, where you've got the intervention and the description, thank you for taking up what we suggested last time, where you've indicated where it's invest to save, and then you've also got some others that are assigned to a different sort of category. I've just got a question on number 4. I might be misunderstanding this. It says, a line increase in EHC plans with statistical neighbours. Now, the reason I'm confused is that we've been told in the past that we have more young people with EHC plans than our statistical neighbours. Yes. So this says we've got to, I think I've misunderstood. It doesn't say that we've got to increase it. What you're saying is we've got to decrease the number of EHC plans in order to be similar to our statistical neighbours. So the wording on that is quite tricky to at first sight. It looks as if we're looking for an increase, and actually we're looking for a decrease. Yes. And so we're back to what we said last time, that the logical thing to say, if we're looking for a decrease in these plans, is that we're going to raise the threshold. And I know that's not a phrase that you like, but for us, that's what it means. So I'd just like your comment on that.
Yeah, I don't know. I wouldn't like to say just raising the thresholds, because if that was just the answer to the problem, that would be an easy solution to put in place, because it is a system change in how we support our children, young people, and our colleagues with children with special educational needs. So in terms of thresholds will be part of a wider system change. So it's about identifying children at the earliest opportunity, and that's starting from our early years sector and investing in our children. One of the investors say we want to do is the children that we know absolutely need a plan from the day they're born, that we sort of bring down the bureaucracy of the assess plan to review and make sure that when it comes into the authority, we can react and put in place the support as quickly as possible. It is about making sure that we capacity build in our settings. At the moment, we work with children. We really need to be working with the adults to empower the adults and enable the adults to work with the children. And I know we've talked about early years. So again, in terms of our early years, what we need to make sure is that when we transitioning children from the nursery settings into school settings, that there is an offer there is a support mechanism. And what we should be able to do with that is de-escalate some of the behaviours and upskill some of the workforce as well as some of the practitioners. That means that really what we will is have a system where we'd embed in good practice, we've embedded in a skill set. Along with that is the threshold. Well, what we're looking at is if we secure all the children that have the highest needs in the county with a plan that releases the staff there that would normally work with them children and be funded to work elsewhere. So what we should be able to see is support going into our primary schools at a point really where, we do actually see a movement in children. We see a lot of applications coming through and schools struggling. In terms of thresholds, the Code of Practice does say that the local authority must assess where there may be a need. However, the local authority or the council are allowed to set thresholds. When I look at other authorities, and I've worked in other authority, in terms of the thresholds, they are very different. And we need to be clear what our thresholds in this authority is around, what type of need and what level of severity of need that we are enshrining in law, in statute, with a plan which can be in existence for up to 25 years. And therefore, what we need to make sure is those that, could be supported at SEN support through good quality teaching, through multidisciplinary working, that's in place. When I looked at the numbers when I arrived in Warwick in February, my rate of growth in my last authority when I left in the same year was 2%. Ours in Warwick was 16% growth. So we are statistical neighbours. So my job in my other authority was the same as this, and yet, statistically we are matched. So I'm not going to say the thresholds won't change, but they'd be more explicit in terms of the type of need and the type of level and severity of need we will be giving children plans to. And it's not only around EHC plans. Your colleague spoke about alternative provision. At the end of the day, there are a lot of children in this authority accessing alternative provision, whether that's through medical needs, post-16 exclusion route. And again, if we are going through the medical needs policy, we need clear thresholds of what need we take in and ownership as a multidisciplinary team for their learners' outcomes. So, if we align with our statistical neighbours, if we align with the national trends, if we're on par. At the moment, we're not. We are, above all them trends. So I can't say it is just about thresholds, because it's not. It's not just about thresholds.
Chairman, can I just ask a question here? So is it normal for someone to ever come off an EHC plan while they are in school? Because what's going through my mind is if we got these plans in early, we might be able to, as it were, wean people off as they got more and more attention that they could go without a plan. But it may be that the plans are now only being allocated to people who've got lifelong conditions. So I'm not quite sure where I am in that. So perhaps you'd help me.
So there are other things we can put in place, which I don't think are in place in Warwickshire at the moment. So let me give you an example. You could have, so if we got children entering the medical needs part of my services and their healthcare needs, you don't need an education, health and care plan if that healthcare isn't affecting the education. You could have an individual healthcare plan, yeah? Likewise, if you have a child or young person, that can dip in and out of SEN support, they can have an SEN support plan, yeah? Now, the thing is, what we do find, and evidence is not just me, is evidence suggests that once you give a statement, the old statement, but now education, health and care plans, you can review that through the annual review process. If families don't want it removed, or the child or young person, every decision at every point you make in this statutory process opens up the route to tribunal. So evidence suggests when you give one, the likelihood you're ever taking that away is very unlikely. So therefore, we need to make sure that when we do commit, the finances via a plan, a statutory plan, that the need is the absolute top need that requires that absolute high level of support. So yeah,
that's very good. Thank you,
Jonathan.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, and I'd just like to echo Margaret's comments. Thank you for putting together that Appendix B on page 95, sort of having that categorisation and also that really clear prioritisation of projects. And yeah, that's the one. And so my question is, would it be possible to put some of the amounts of money you expect possibly to save, even if it's a range, alongside those, especially those priority one projects? Now, I have seen some of those figures in another document, but I can't quite remember where, so it'd be helpful to have those, especially for the priority one. And then in future, when we come back and you're giving updates about this project, to keep this format and then maybe just do a little update on especially the priority one projects so that we can see the progress, and that would be really, really helpful. So yeah, thanks for putting this together. It's making it a lot clearer for me, certainly.
Yeah, so can I just go back into the Send Inclusion Change programme? Before my arrival, there were a few programmes that were already in place. One being the PAYS project that was always, that was up and running, and that has already had costs assigned to it. In terms of the Empower report, there were 6 identified trials in there, 3 trials, and some of them were costed. So some of the costings are in other reports. Haven't been here since February. In terms of looking at the things that I think that need to be done, and we are looking at our baseline and bringing the baseline in and look at the savings or efficiencies. Some of the projects are invest to save. What we're saying is, if we invest earlier on, if we look at the service we got, some of our services are traded, is that the right option to have? And if we get it in sooner, though it'll cost us at the beginning, what we will see is a tail off at the end. And that comes back down to a question earlier on around what is our offer, and I don't mean the local offer, I mean what is our stock of schools, of specialist provision, special schools. How do we bring that through like a graduated approach? So what we are working on, and I'm happy to bring Ross in here, is actually on some of the costings now and baselining it and saying, okay, if we change the percentage shift just by 6% or align it with statistical neighbours, what would that give us? Ross, I don't know if you want to come in and add something here.
Thanks, Dwayne, and hello to the committee. Excuse me. Yeah, in terms of which ones have savings and which ones don't, actually, not everything has a saving against it. So if, there are things we are confident of. So if, on the page that we're looking at the moment, the PAYS site, as we just said, we are confident that is an investor save and has a strong business case to show that. And in this DSG recovery plan, the sustainability plan, I think we show what the impact of that we think will be. The second one, as an example, the SEND transformation, changing the conversation, which is down as kind of 96. It's the second one on your screen at the moment. At the moment, we haven't included that in the savings calculations. We see that as a better way of working. There is a logic to say that that will deliver savings, but we are not confident that we can quantify those at the moment. You'll also be aware there's a gap at the moment in between what we are suggesting the savings that can be made and actually the budget allocations that we will have. So that is one that after the trial we will say whether we'll be more confident to say whether that can deliver savings or not. But that is a better way of working as well. It's also the trial that we want to make. If I just go down and pick out some others as well, generally where you see recovery plan, we are confident that savings can be made. So the use of alternative provision, we are confident that savings can be made from that. 126, I'm going about halfway down. SEND inclusion strategy, quality assurance framework. That's not that one in particular isn't to deliver savings. That is better ways of working and being really having better quality EHC plans and addressing that. And again, that's part of the wider fundamental changes required in our system. And then you have some. So if I look the one below that, 128, the sustainability plan, the finance processes, that's actually not going to deliver a saving in itself, but we'll be able to report better and have better systems and discipline in terms of our financial management as a result of doing that project. So as a guide, Jonathan, in terms of where it says recovery plan, we have a saving against it. Where it doesn't, then usually they are kind of wider changes that we need to make in the system. And as Dwayne says, actually they need to go hand in hand with the savings. If we don't change the culture, change the practice, change the expectations, and just have a standalone savings program, then I don't think that will work and doesn't offer anything back. So I'm not sure we'll be able to deliver improved outcomes if we don't make those other changes.
Okay, thank you, Ross.
Thank you. That's really helpful. So would you be able to almost next time we come back to this subject is put a column in and almost just put that one line that you've just given for some of those in? That would be really helpful, and maybe that indication of confidence you've got as well is really helpful. Just sort of I don't know, some kind of confidence interval that's easy to look at, and I think that would really help us look at this next time. But thank you for putting that together.
Yes, we can do, just to respond to that. In terms of, we'll be monitored internally by the savings that we're looking to make against some of these, or indeed just delivering against them for those non-savings items. That's what we'll be reporting back to the project board. And for some of those savings items, just to make clear as well, we know the preparatory work that will need to be done. So that some of the savings won't be delivered for a couple of years because we need to change the system first. The changes in alternative provision is one of those where we need to make changes to the system first before we can see those kind of efficiencies released.
Yeah, and I just think this is a massive long-term project, isn't it? And the fact that you were putting figures in through to 27, 28, I think is an indication of we're sort of going to tackle this over the next several years.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, in terms of this tanker, it's a big tanker to turn. I would say we're slightly behind the curve in terms of other authorities have been working on this quite a few years ago. But certainly, what we've got to look at is the rate of change now, how quick or how fast we move along the curve to make sure that we align ourselves in line with other statistical neighbours and the national trends, because we are off kilter in terms of all the baseline information.
Thank you both. Colin, did you want to come in?
Yes, please. Just again, a few general observations, if I can. I was really supportive of this paper at Cabinet, and I do commend it to you all. I think it gives us a real chance of being able to have a sort of future viability, if you like, for SEN within Warwickshire County Council. And we are pressing government for more money because, frankly, there isn't enough money in the system at the moment to be able to provide everyone with everything they need. We're going to have to target some of those resources where needs are highest and where we can have the most impact on the vulnerable children in question. So we're going to have to be asking schools to do more in terms of the less needy children, and try and take some of the pressure off that way. We're going to be having some difficult conversations with certain parents, I think, where we feel that their needs are not sufficient for an EHC plan, or certain types of provision within an EHC plan. So I'm saying that politically, with a small p, there will be consequences to this, because there will be parents who are not happy with some of the outcomes for their children. Hopefully only a small number, but there will inevitably be some, and they will come to their counsellors, I imagine, saying this is awful, this is terrible. And I just think we need to be aware that this is not necessarily going to be the easy ride that we might hope. It is going to be bumpy, and we need to be ready for that.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Colin. Are there any other questions from members? Obviously conscious that we did cover a lot of the content in the last meeting. No? Okay, well, we have a recommendation. We did actually, the last meeting, we did say that we would lobby our own MPs in Warwickshire so that they could in turn lobby central government. So I think we need to do that, Helen, if we haven't already penned the letter. We do that rather urgently. Add our voice to the call for more money. Going to the recommendations on the first page, then there is the simple standard recommendation that we comment on the paper, but can we also just add, it does say at 6.3 that overview and scrutiny will be continually updated. Can we just add that into the recommendations if members are happy with that, just so it's in black and white? And the only other note I made was about the funding. So Helen, if we can make a note and get that letter out, that'd be great. Anyone unhappy with that, members, as an additional point? No. Okay, well, thank you, Dwayne. Thank you, Ross. Thank you, Colin. On to the work programme. Any comments from members? Margaret.
Thanks, Chairman. I might have missed it, but when I asked about a paper on school placements, I think Ian said that was coming up, and I can't see it unless it's hidden in one of these titles that I haven't recognised. But I really would, at some point anyway, like to look at school placements across the county so we can identify the hotspots.
Yeah, we'll make sure it's on there. Any other comments from members?
Sufficient.
I think in terms of the recovery programme, are we bringing together all the work that's been done currently? That it won't actually finish until July, I don't think, but I think we need to try and look at that, because maybe we need to look at that. It's in all of the meetings, it's all of the meetings. So is it going to bring together all of those groups that are currently working on it?
Groups. It's a good question. Can anyone answer that, officer-wise?
Well, maybe we can do that. We can ask that all the groups report into, because the different groups, I think, are important in terms of looking at the recovery programme.
Yeah, those that are relevant, absolutely. Okay, we'll make sure Helen's made a note of that. Corinne.
Oops. Thank you, Chair. Were we putting IEPs on this work programme at some point, or was that just going to be an update and a briefing note?
Briefing note, I believe. I'm not sure if Colin or Ian can come in. If not, we'll clarify that it will simply either be on as a briefing note or on an agenda for a meeting.
Can that go out to all members and not just children's?
Sure.
Yeah.
I think why not?
And at what point would we be due a review of sort of the RISE service and the numbers and things? I know it's not been that long, but CAMS and RISE and that kind of thing.
Can any officer come in on that?
If Nigel's not with us, I'll Nigel's hands up.
I am back. Yeah, sorry. I tried to answer the last question, but my system wouldn't let me. We have said, and I get slightly nervous about how we report on CAMS and RISE, because it goes to both adults and children's overview and scrutiny committees. But there is certainly a plan for an update in the autumn on the autism strategy and the associated kind of performance indicators. So it's probably sensible to, if we can, to either do them, have the same report go to both committees, or if the chairs are happy to agree, to have a joint meeting again at the right time to look at that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, speak to Councillor Redford. Pam, did you want to come back in?
Yes, we talked about the housing project in previous meetings, and I think we need to have a look at that, because in terms of young people moving on, it's been a very successful project in Nuneaton, and I would like to see that replicated in other areas if possible, particularly given that we've had a lot of staying put during COVID. So I wonder if we could incorporate that into the work plan going forward. Maybe it's not urgent to do it within the next couple of months, but certainly for November maybe, or February, if that's possible. I don't know what Nigel thinks of that.
Chair, if I may, we're more than happy to do an update on the house project. I suppose it's just a matter for members, if you want an actual event, you want it to be part of a meeting, or you want to report, maybe you could talk to some young people, so we can do that. Or if you just want an updated briefing on where we're up to and what the plans are, I'm happy either way to provide whatever members want, really.
I think it'd be really useful to hear from the young people, because they've done so well, and they were so enthusiastic, and the way they've all worked together and created their own community, I think it's to be applauded. But I'd also like to get the districts involved in terms of stock and looking at what's available. And that's something that I think we haven't managed very well previously. So I would like to send some invites out to the districts to discuss the possibility of finding properties for our young people. I don't know whether that's something we could consider in those sort of meetings.
Okay. Jeff.
Thanks. Yes, I'd like to reassure members that the intention behind the house project very much is to extend it to other parts of the county. I think we all feel it's a cracking project that we really ought to get behind as much as possible. So it always was our intention to look for additional accommodation in other parts of the county. So you know, you're pushing at an open door there, Pam, certainly.
Brilliant, thanks, Jeff. Corin, did you want to come back in, or was your hand just still up?
Sorry, it's just still up.
Okay, no worries. Pam, same?
No, that's fine, thank you. That's
Thank
great. So look forward to having it on the programme, maybe November.
Okie dokie. Right, there's nothing further. The date of the next meeting virtually, again, is the 29th September. Thank you all for attending.
Thank you,
Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you.
Bye.
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 Thank you. Bye.
Helen, are you still on?